I'm Mark Devenport. I'm BBC Northern Ireland's political editor. I'm normally at Stormont, as you know. There's hardly anybody there these days, so this is quite a novel experience. I'm beginning to experience agoraphobia with this big crowd here. We've got a mixture of politicians and commentators here. I won't run through everybody because we're not taking the question and answer session until after the initial presentation. But John Garry, who is one of the brains behind the report that was released in conjunction with this meeting on attitudes to Brexit in Northern Ireland, will kick us off with a 15-minute presentation, I'm told, and he's going to make that from the podium now. So John, if you can kick us off, and then we'll go over to the participants and some question and answer session.
Thanks very much, Mark, and thanks very much to the organisers. Our research team yesterday published a report entitled Northern Ireland and the UK's Exit from the EU. What do people think? And as you've already noticed today, an awful lot of us in this room have opinions about Northern Ireland, and so we took the novel approach of actually asking the people of Northern Ireland what they thought about the whole situation. And today I want to highlight some of the key findings of that report, which has been distributed on every second seat in the hall. I want to address a number of questions. Question one, what border arrangements would people in Northern Ireland find impossible to accept? First of all, between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and secondly, between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. Question number two, if there were any protests against any new border checks, would there be support for such protests, either between the North and the South or between NI and GB? Question three, what are people's attitudes to the customs union and single market? This is quite relevant because staying in the customs union and single market is one way of avoiding any new possible border checks and therefore avoiding any possible problems of acceptance of them and protest against them. Question four, will Brexit or UK exit have any effect on attitudes to a united Ireland? In particular, comparing the status quo, membership of the EU, to a hard Brexit. And particularly, we're looking at the conditionality of Catholic opinion. In this report, we use evidence from two empirical investigations. One, an attitude survey, and secondly, a deliberative forum. The attitude survey consists of data from a representative sample of over 1,000 people all across Northern Ireland. It was conducted in February-March 2018, and the fieldwork was conducted by Ipsos Mori, Northern Ireland. Our deliberative forum was a one-day event that occurred on February 10 this year. Here we invited 48 ordinary or typical people from all across Northern Ireland to come together in one place. These 48 are broadly representative in terms of demographic traits and are balanced with respect to people who voted Leave and voted Remain in the 2016 referendum. At this one-day deliberative forum, the citizens listened to expert presentations on the implications of UK exit for Northern Ireland. They then engaged in discussion, reflection and consideration on these issues. Again, this work was conducted in conjunction with Ipsos Mori, Northern Ireland. I'd like to begin answering the questions that I have specified by focusing on the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. This graph shows the percentage of people in Northern Ireland who would find it almost impossible to accept certain possible potential border controls between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. In the overall population, 14% of people would find any new camera-based technology almost impossible to accept. This rises to 41% for any new customs checks and to 54% if the customs agents manning these checks had to be protected for whatever reason by British soldiers. These percentages rise when one looks at the Catholic community. 1 in 5 Catholics find any new camera-based technology at the border impossible to accept. 55% of them would find customs checks impossible to accept, and 72% would find British soldiers' presence impossible to accept. There's variation within the Catholic community. If we look at Catholics who support Sinn Féin, we find stronger figures. 31% would find cameras almost impossible to accept, 70% customs checks, and 82% the presence of British soldiers. Now, it's one thing to say you find something impossible to accept. The question then arises, would you be supportive of any protests that may occur against the occurrence of such checks? If there were protests against north-south border checks, would people support such protests? This is a graph showing the percentage of people in Northern Ireland who would be supportive of different types of protest against any possible new north-south border checks. In relation to demonstrations that would block traffic, for example, 15% of the overall population would be supportive, almost a quarter of Catholics, 22%, and 36% of Catholics who support Sinn Féin. In terms of support for vandalising cameras, we find almost 1 in 10 Catholics would be supportive, and 15% of Catholics who support Sinn Féin. It's noteworthy that in terms of possible support for attacking a potential border infrastructure or installations, 1 in 10 of Catholics who vote Sinn Féin would express support. At our deliberative forum, we facilitated citizens in discussing their reactions and their feelings with respect to any possible or potential border controls between the north and the south. A number of themes emerged. One prevalent theme was that any new border checks north-south would represent going back to the past. For example, one female Protestant Remain voter says, "I could see it going the way it was before, roads being closed off in various places because they can't properly police it." One Catholic Remainer male said, "It would be a nightmare. I think that's going back in time." Another prevalent theme that emerged was people expressing potential concern about any inconvenience that might occur. One young female middle-class Catholic said, "I would go to the Sleeve Russell, that's a hotel, all the time, and it's over the border. You know, if you're wanting to just go to the spa or go for something to eat, do I need to bring my passport? What about normal day-to-day stuff? Say I want to walk the dog. I'm literally 10 minutes across the border. It would be a nightmare." Another prevalent theme with respect to potential north-south checks related to the potential for violent protest. There were concerns and expectations that protests against new checks would quickly descend into violence. One middle-class male Catholic Remainer, for example, said protests would start peaceful and then if they don't get anywhere, they would just escalate it. One male working-class Protestant Leave voter said, "I think the ceasefire would go." There was discussion of the role of cameras at the deliberative forum, and at one level, several participants expressed said it was okay to have cameras. They said, you know, cameras are a part and parcel of modern life and everyone's existence. But that was also allied to a prevalent expectation and concern that cameras would likely be graffitiized and vandalised. For example, cameras wouldn't annoy me. CCTV is everywhere in Northern Ireland. Or the cameras would have to be about 300 feet in the air, and even then, you will get certain people who take the law onto themselves and cut these things down. So to lessen it, it would have to be the softest, hardest border. Military checkpoint is a no-no. Cameras, that would be a no-no as well. Several participants, typically Protestants who voted to leave, expressed indifference to any possible hardening of the north-south border. One female working-class Protestant Leave voter said, it wouldn't annoy me about the border. It wouldn't annoy me at all. We had it years ago, and also, too, I go to Spain and Gibraltar. It's exactly the same. Another said, sure, if you go to America or Canada, you've got to go through a border there. Anyway, I want to pause just for a second and mentally move to moving away from the north-south border towards thinking about any potential new border controls between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, the so-called east-west possible border. We asked the respondents in our representative survey the almost exactly the same questions that we asked with respect to north-south. This graph shows the responses of people in the population who say that they would find any new border controls between Northern Ireland and Great Britain almost impossible to accept. And what's striking is that there's a similarity in Catholic and Protestant responses. So 15% of Catholics and 16% of Protestants say that cameras would be impossible to accept. Almost the exact same percentages for customs checks, 28, 29%. In some responses, Catholics express more antipathy. For example, if British soldiers were under any iteration of this necessary, a lot more Catholics would express antipathy to that possibility than Protestants. In terms of asking people if they would be supportive of any protest that may possibly occur as a function of the implementation of new East-West border checks, we find quite a high degree of support in the general population for peaceful protest, whether that's petition or peaceful demonstration. And we find some support, but less than for North-South with respect to more extreme protests. So in the overall population, 12% of people said that they would support illegal protests such as blocking traffic. But the figures are lower for the other forms. In the deliberative forum, again, we facilitated people, the citizens, in reflecting upon and discussing what they thought about possible border quote down the Irish Sea. A number of concerns emerged, one of which was political and typically expressed by Protestant Leave voters. One example from a working class Protestant Leave male says, "We're still part of the UK, why should there be a border? If you're travelling from the south to the UK, you're travelling from a different country. Yes, that's going to be different, but from Northern Ireland, that's still part of the UK." Economic concerns were also articulated, and typically by Catholic rather than Protestant participants. One example, it wouldn't be political, it would be more financial. It's the inconvenience and the expense. I'm thinking from a business point of view, and that's the way I'm thinking, not politically at all. As was the case for North-South, there was a fear and a concern and an expectation that if protests occurred against any new East-West border checks, they would descend into extreme forms of protest. One male working class person said it would probably be a lot worse than if there was a border between North and South. One male Protestant leaver said it would be like flag protests again, and it could escalate if they were forced into a hard border, non-violent to start off with, and then it would be blocking roads. So I've discussed a little bit about a possible North-South border and a possible East-West border. I now want to report the findings from the representative sample survey when people were asked which particular type of UK exit would you prefer. If the UK is leaving the EU, it could do so in a number of ways. Which of these ways would you prefer? And the question wording was as follows. Option number 1, a hard Brexit for all of the UK. That means Great Britain and Northern Ireland leave the EU, and this involves leaving the single market and customs union. A soft Brexit for all of the UK, that means Great Britain and Northern Ireland leave the EU, but both of them stay in the single market and the customs union. Or, so-called mixed approach, a hard Brexit for Great Britain, but a soft Brexit for Northern Ireland. In other words, Britain leaves the EU and the single market and the customs union, and Northern Ireland leaves the EU but stays in the single market and customs union. So, UK is leaving the EU, which do you want? And there's a fairly clear winner of those options, in that from all respondents, 61% of all respondents go for the soft UK-wide exit option. In other words, the UK leaves the EU but remains in the single market and the customs union. What's interesting to note about the responses is that we find concurrent majorities in both of the principal communities in Northern Ireland. In other words, a majority of Protestants and a majority of Catholics would favour this particular option, 62% of Protestants, 61% of Catholics. It's somewhat unusual in Northern Ireland research to find very great similarities of position between Catholics and Protestants, so that is noteworthy. Looking again at the all column, we see that the second most preferred option is the mixed option, hard Brexit for Great Britain and a soft Brexit for Northern Ireland. The least preferred of the three exit options is the hard Brexit option, whereby the UK as a whole leaves the single market and the customs union. Finally, I want to touch on the possible relationship between UK exit and attitudes to a United Ireland. Is support for United Ireland linked to the type of exit that the UK will put into effect? The first thing to note is that there isn't a very large percentage of people in the overall population who would vote for a United Ireland. It's at 21%. There's a lot of don't knows. In the Catholic community, the overall percent, before I talk about this graph, is 42%, and there's a lot of don't knows. What we sought to do was kind of crystal ball gaze a little bit and try to imagine how UK exit might, in the years to come, the next 2 or 3 years or so, affect attitudes. So we offered people a range of conditions. And the difference conveyed by the EU flag is the difference in the level of support among Catholics for a United Ireland when you compare two things. A, the UK changes its mind, clicks its fingers and said we're staying in the EU. Under that iteration, 28% of Catholics would vote for a United Ireland. If we have the hardest of Brexit, where the UK leaves the EU and the customs union and the single market, we find a doubling of the proportion of Catholics who would support a United Ireland, up to 53%. So this is an attempt to get at an indication of the possible direction of travel, not a prediction of what would happen now. Overall, we, in our combination of these two empirical investigations, a conventional representative sample and a deliberative forum, which allows us to get the best of both worlds, statistical robustness allied to the richness and nuance that's typically associated with qualitative research. What we find in conclusion is a substantial and intense opposition to possible North-South and NIGB border checks. We find strong expectations of protest against North-South and East-West border checks. And we find a substantial majority, indeed a majority in both communities, for the type of UK exit that would largely eliminate the need for any North-South or East-West border checks, namely the UK as a whole to remain in the customs union and single market. And we find Catholic support for unification in Ireland increases if there is a hard Brexit. Our job here is not to tell anyone exactly what to do. Our job here is to report what the people of Northern Ireland think. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, John, for those illuminating figures. We're going to turn to our panel now. Now, we have a couple of MLAs here. To my left, Máirtín Muilleoir, who was previously Finance Minister at Stormont. Claire Hanna over here from the SDLP, their representative in South Belfast. We have Lord Bew, Paul Bew, who was previously an advisor to the former First Minister David Trimble, but now sits as a crossbench peer in the House of Lords. And to the far left here, Sam McBride, political editor, correspondent, can't remember the title now, very good bloke anyway, from the newsletter, the Eunice leading newsletter. I'm going to ask, though, Brendan O'Leary, Professor O'Leary, who's also a co-author on this report, to just supplement some of John Garry's comments. And I'm also going to ask people to bob up and down, because I'm told that you disappear completely from the live stream if you are not standing. So if you could take to the floor, please.
I'll happily look down on you, Mark.
No problem.
Thank you, John. I'm Brendan O'Leary. My co-authors are also here, Jamie Pow and Kevin McNichol. The first point to notice about the report is that it's a general feature of surveys in ethnically divided places that people underreport their extremism. So the figures that we have presented we think are social scientifically valid, but we would suggest that if anything, the direction of actual travel would be to see more extremism than our results suggest. The second thing that's important to draw as an empirical and factual conclusion from our report is that there's a clear four-part structure to preferences in Northern Ireland. The Northern Irish want to remain in the EU. That's their first preference. And that has gone up from 56% to 69%. And that's with a plus or minus 3 variation that's standard in all surveys. So they would prefer to remain number one. If forced to choose, their second preference, as John outlined, represents a concurrent majority of Catholics and Protestants. And what is rare is for there to be a concurrent majority of Catholics and Protestants that is identical. Given the margin of error of plus or minus 3%, 61% for Catholics, 62% for Protestants is in effect an identical result. So the very clear preference for the Northern Irish in both communities is for the UK to remain in the customs union and in the single market. In third place is what we may say is a reasonable representation of the backstop option. Namely, Northern Ireland would remain in the customs union and the regulatory structure of the single market, whereas Great Britain would leave. That's a third preference in Northern Ireland. It's supported by roughly a quarter of the population, and it obviously polarises them. It's preferred more by Catholics than by Protestants. In last place, and in distinct last place, with 15% support, is a hard exit from both the customs union and the single market. The Democratic Unionist Party factually does not represent the interests of its voters on this question. 1 out of 3 DUP supporters support a hard exit. The others have preferences across the other options. So if anyone claims that they know what the preferences of the Northern Ireland public are and they deviate from what we've just announced, we would suggest that they conduct another poll asking the same questions to see if they get a different result. We predict that they're likely to get a variation of plus or minus 3. And by the way, if you give us funding to do it, we'll be happy to do it again. We'll be happy to invite others to participate with this. If you ask a politically prescriptive question, John is inhibited from asking such questions. One of the themes and indeed principles of the Good Friday Agreement is that both governments, the London government and the Dublin government, committed to be rigorously impartial across both communities over any key questions. I ask you to consider what would be rigorously impartial given this preference structure. I would argue that the only way you can be rigorously impartial is to follow the idea that the concurrent majority across both communities should be respected. The second theme I'd like to take up in what John remarked upon is the question of preferences about a united Ireland. There are a very high number of don't knows among Catholics. One way of interpreting the results is that 50% are firmly in favour of the Union, 21% are firmly in favour of a united Ireland come what may. In all of the conditional configurations, Protestant preferences for remaining in the Union more or less stay the same. But Catholic preferences are obviously highly conditional. And if I was advising the Democratic Unionist Party or the Conservative Party, I would say, given the degree of potential volatility in the Catholic vote and the high proportion of don't knows, you would be risking the union of Great Britain and Northern Ireland at some future juncture, especially if you go for a hard exit. And I think that would be reasonable factual advice. A feature of our deliberative forum and of our questions that was not highlighted in what John presented was the concerns that are expressed in both communities, but particularly in the Catholic community, about potential losses of rights that would flow from the UK's exit from the European Union. You won't be surprised to discover that, rather like the British, people are confused about the difference between the European Convention on Human Rights and the European Charter of Rights. They're confused about the difference between the Court of Justice of the European Union and the court that guards the Convention. But what they're not confused about is what rights they're worried about. They're worried about the potential loss of anti-discrimination and equality rights. So one way in which the British government could respond to these concerns is to make absolutely unambiguously clear that the relevant statutes implementing anti-discrimination and equality provisions will continue come what may, and that they will continue to respect and abide by the decisions of the European Convention on Human Rights come what may. There's plenty more I could editorialise on, but I shouldn't. And I commend our report to you, and we're very happy to take questions on it.
Okay. Thanks, Brendan. I think we've got plenty of people here who can editorialise on this. I'm going to start off with Máirtín and Muilleoir. If we were together at the Stormont Great Hall, we would, I think this afternoon, have been witnessing 4 parties Sinn Féin, the SDLP, the Greens and Alliance all presenting, if you like, a joint statement on Brexit, asking for the UK to stay in the customs union and the single market, saying they represent the majority of opinion there, but of course not in Westminster, which is somewhere where you could be but aren't, Máirtín. But would you want to respond to this report and what you see in it? Again, from a...
Thank you, Mark. If we were in Stormont Great Hall, we'd have the gift of bilocation like Padre Pio, and that would be a wonderful achievement for both of us. I want to thank the organisers for the invite to be here today to take part in the conference. Boilan Buíochas or the Lochtagri na Cógála. I always like to start any address in London in Irish because where I'm from, I'm told that the use of Irish diminishes your Britishness. So if anyone is here and leaves at the end of the day and feels a little bit more diminished in their Britishness, I'm afraid that me to blame. One of the great, I think, common ground, areas of common ground, which is magnified in this report, is that in the place I'm from, which is often sadly divided, the common ground on the issue of Brexit is very strong and is holding and is expanding according to this report. And the reason for that isn't just economic, and I'm really pleased that the former Taoiseach John Bruton is here today, a great advocate for the European experiment, the European Union. And one of the things that isn't highlighted enough is the issue of culture and values. And I want to use the opportunity of the report to explain why a majority in what we call both communities, which is a dreadful term, but why a majority across the north of Ireland support continuation of our membership of the European Union and want to remain, want the status quo to pertain, but want to remain in the European Union because we are European. Because the peace process, which was the greatest gift ever given to my generation, which transformed my life and the life of our children and grandchildren, is the crowning achievement of the European Union. European Union, of course, itself is a peace project founded to end war. And the fact that the peace process, we celebrate the Good Friday Agreement, a referendum we celebrated 20 years ago today, was brought into being in part because the EU goes to the heart of why we wish to remain as Europeans. Our equilibrium, the balance we have found in the peace process today, despite the tensions, the absence of violence, the prosperity that our community enjoys, this new era which our young people are exploiting to create new relationships, to foster reconciliation, to build justice, to encourage diversity. All that, in my view, is pinned on our membership of the European Union. So the last thing, because it's a great day for telling stories when you're in London, we have been Europeans for a long time, perhaps 2,000 years, but certainly since 590, when a man called St. Columbanus took the boat from Bangor to Scotland, where he set up monasteries, to St. Gallen, now Switzerland, where he set up the monastery at St. Gallen, to Paul Bew, where he planted his vineyard and lived out the rest of his days and died in 614. Now that's a long time ago to be a European, and no one should think that we will blithely say to our dear friends and the Tories and the DUP who are AWOL today that it's okay, you're going to take our European values and culture from us, because we will not accept that. So there's a story for you.
Thanks very much. The Tories weren't quite AWOL today because Owen Paterson did open the gathering, but certainly we don't have any unionist representatives here on the panel. But as I stated at the start, Lord Bew in a previous life did work very closely with David Trimble. So I think I'm going to go to you, Paul, to give us a perspective both on this report and maybe on the perception that perhaps the union is being risked in relation to Brexit.
Well, thank you for the invitation to be here. And I also want to thank John and Brendan for the presentation. Now, I have a couple of thoughts on their presentation. The first one is a request really for John for a degree of, I hope it winds up to clarification, is reference to any new cameras, etc. There already are cameras. And the reason why I'm saying this is really quite important in how the question of the border might be sorted out. They are already there at the moment. Any new checks, he also referred to, I wrote it down. In fact, I heard Simon Coveney say on Mar Sunday week ago, it was intolerable to the Irish government to have any check anywhere on the island of Ireland. The point is there are already checks now while we're in the EU, and they're particularly pronounced on the Irish side. Buses going down are frequently stopped. My wife sits on the Irish Management's Commission in Dublin. Buses stopped Irish, since before and after Brexit, by Irish customs officials are getting on board, checking individuals. Those people who run tours will tell you it's a frequent event. So are we talking about any checks, any new checks? Are we talking about no cameras at all, possibility that the camera is already there, are okay? I don't quite know, and I don't quite know what this polling means if people were asked about any new. Where are we on what already exists? And as I say, at the moment, the checks are actually more pronounced for personnel, at any rate, on the Irish side, on buses. And I travel up and down a lot, and everybody who does it will tell you that. So I think we need to clarify. Now, something Brendan said I thought was very profound, and I totally agree with him. People are stronger in opinion polls, or weaker and more moderate in all polls we ever had in Northern Ireland than they are in real terms. And I think by the dynamics he identifies in this poll are entirely correct in all respects, including what's happening or could happen within Catholic opinion. I agree with him completely. But there are two important political considerations here. There isn't somebody from the DUP here. Just make the point. They are absolutely, as a party, indifferent to the form of the British exit from the European Union. You make a very good case for saying they shouldn't be. Some members of the DUP are committed Brexiteers, Sammy Wilson and so on. Others are not. Everybody knows that the senior members of the DUP vote to remain. Many people vote to remain in Northern Ireland, as indeed I did, simply because we calculate it would have the destabilising effect on Catholic opinion, north and south, that precisely it has. But the DUP is not in the play for pushing for a hard or a soft Brexit here. Anything that the UK does, which Northern Ireland is going with in the same flow, it will accept. I also think there are certain types of compromises it might accept in and around there. But there is something else to say. The Alliance Party was mentioned, involved today with Sinn Féin and others, the SDLP, on an agreed programme about single market and the customs union. The Alliance Party held the East Belfast seat between 2010 and 2015, and we're talking about dynamics. It lost it in 2015. It lost it stunningly after Brexit, even though some bookmakers at the beginning of the campaign thought that the DUP would lose that seat to the Alliance Party. This tells you that in middle Protestant opinion, where the velocity is going. And again, if you look at North Down, fitting alongside that stunning vote for the DUP, not expected by the DUP, where again Sylvia Herman was a moderate independent unionist, very strongly pro-Europe. Again, if you look at the vote, the DUP now feels it could have won that seat if it had known they were going to push her so close. Hugely popular figure. It's important, and Brendan's comments are here important, it's important to look at how people actually vote and how they have voted recently, if you're going to get a sense of where opinion is and what that means and what's actually going on. And the DUP performance in the last election far exceeded what I expected, far exceeded what they expected. It's absolutely true there was a stronger nationalist vote than there would otherwise have been but for Brexit. But despite Brexit, there was also a stronger unionist vote, and this is where we actually are in Northern Ireland. Now, I want to just conclude by saying a couple of words about this, about these other issues. I want to actually talk for a minute about the Republic of Ireland for a minute, an opinion. I think it is very interesting the way senior commentators like Dan O'Brien, like Stephen Collins, are writing about this issue. They're strongly against Brexit. They take the view that virtually all Irish people take, that the British government should never have inflicted this thing on Ireland. It's a very bad idea, and so on. But in both those very senior commentators, both absolutely centrist and both experienced, there is a concern that the Irish government may be overplaying its hand at this particular time. And if you even look at the Irish Times editorial on the latest polling last week on Brexit, they were keen to point out that Taoiseach actually did have a degree of flexibility here. I'm mentioning this because in Britain people have become too obsessed with the Irish border, and it is a very important issue, and it is why I voted Remain, because I could see this horrible debate. Right, it's very important. There are also things like Irish farmers who want to continue to have access to the British market. These are also very important people. Some of them are my relatives, and I know exactly what they think, and I know that they actually think the Taoiseach goes on too much about the border and not enough about securing the long-term economic interests of Ireland. I say this because people in this country do not think about Irish opinion except insofar as it fires into their debate on Brexit. And they only want to hear opinions, whether technology will work on the border, what the Taoiseach has said, according to whether they're for or against Brexit. There is a real Ireland which exists independently of what British people think about the decision to leave the European Union or not. And that real Ireland has more complicated views on this matter. And I assure you it is going to play in ways I can't predict, but because I know it exists, it's going to play in the next 2 months. And this has to be taken account of, as well as the internal politics of Northern Ireland. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul. We're going to hear next now from Claire Hanna, South Belfast MLA. Claire was one of the sort of leading voices on the Remain side during the referendum campaign back in 2016. I'm sure you won't be surprised by a lot of those findings there, because the concern about Brexit, I think, was what you were echoing. But were you surprised that actually, notwithstanding all of that, there was still a lead for staying in the UK? I think it was 50% backing that, only 21% backing United Ireland.
Yeah, I think, I think even those of us who know the dynamic has genuinely changed, even for the softest end of nationalism. You don't follow one big, massive constitutional question with a yes/no answer with another one, and I think people realise the folly of doing something so substantial. So I think there's definitely ground shifting there, but it doesn't surprise me that it hasn't borne out in polls. I want to make two wee points about the context of the last Westminster elections, and that was the polarisation around some of the identity issues. Yes, Brexit is plumbing a lot of the politics in Northern Ireland at the moment, but there was an insertion of issues around language and so on. And as we know in Northern Ireland, if the issue is identity, people who agree run in one direction and people who don't run in the opposite direction. So that plus the other backstory to that election was nobody thought that Northern Irish MPs could possibly have any impact. The underlying narrative was, well, what could these 18 MPs ever have? And I think both of those things have changed slightly. The numbers ring very true in terms of and I don't know if you did get to ask how many didn't want to leave at all, but certainly in terms of the support for soft Brexit, if there has to be Brexit. And I will say I feel a little bit of a momentum, although we've had false dawns over the last 2 years about when there might be a breakthrough for something sensible about that. But in the spirit of the agreement and the referendum campaign that was 20 years ago today, you want to give people a little bit of space to come to a position, and I'm sure that the DUP will be looking at those figures as well in terms of the support for a hard Brexit within their own voter base. And it's the loss of the Assembly to have some of these conversations, which is actually quite sad, because the DUP aren't going to resile from a very extreme position, on the Nolan show or on another extreme debate show or anything like that. But scenarios where they're presented with evidence would be the most useful. But it is the uncertainty and it's the drawing out of it, I think, that's the problem for politics, because what Brexit did in the exact opposite to the Good Friday Agreement, which was about dialing down the importance of your allegiance and sovereignty and your your identity, and slammed all of that stuff straight back into politics, so that every time you turn on the radio it's talking about the border or passports or some of those issues, and that's what's causing the difficulty, and that's why something like a long transition would be dreadful for Northern Ireland. And I know a lot of MPs think that might be the solution. Just let us go into this interminable transition period. But that plus the dynamic in the relationships between Dublin and London, because Northern Ireland confidence in the process requires confident relationships with Dublin and London dealing with each other as equals and friends. But so while the support for the soft Brexit is definitely the least awful type of Brexit, it's important to note that it is still Brexit. I appreciate that's the reality of the fact that Britain does seem completely determined to Brexit despite the narrowness of it. And as I say, it's the least awful, but of course it will bring forward all sorts of issues around a genuine democratic deficit deficit as opposed to the imagined democratic deficit that fed some of the Brexit discourse. But in terms of where you put the border, and this is the really important thing, that after 2 years of imaginary solutions, and we are getting to crunch time on this, single market and customs union, the softest Brexit, is the only answer. It's the only way to avoid some form of border, which clearly has been demonstrated would be unacceptable either north, south and east, west. And it's important to say from the SDLP's perspective, we don't want to see either. We respect the Good Friday Agreement and the relationships in all their parts. I do find it slightly ironic, a lot of people who have said, oh, well, a north-south border would be fine and frictionless and nothing to worry about, but an east-west border would be politically and practically impossible. And that's a kind of a double think that nobody's explained to me, but it's important to us in terms of the dynamics and the relationships and the practicalities that there's no border, and the only way to do that is the soft Brexit that clearly has huge support.
Just Claire, if you just stay on your feet for a moment. I was just going to ask, obviously Karen Bradley, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, ruled out customs union membership just the other day. Now we do know that the government is edging towards alignment for a temporary period of time with the rules and regulations of single market and customs union if this backstop comes into effect. Do you think there can be a sort of a not the customs union or a not the single market fudge that would take us over this particular hump?
I don't believe there can be. I don't believe that the European Union would have any real motivation to give a fudge, if you mean in terms of loosening any one of the four freedoms. But yes, Karen Bradley said that, and yet there have been a lot of red lines. But even as recently as this morning, and I know Nigel Dodds doesn't speak for the government, but didn't rule out, and Arlene Foster didn't mention yesterday, a red line around opposition to the single market and the customs union. And in fact, Nigel Dodds' reasoning why they weren't going that way is because nobody was advocating for it in Westminster, and certainly a small number of voices are. So, and we know there is a substantial parliamentary majority for a customs union, and I suspect for a single market. I don't know. I'm not close enough to the ground or anything to know that, but I appreciate that Karen Bradley or the London government, it's not their number one solution. But if the DUP are making clear their red line is the integrity of the UK and their support depends on that, then again, as all the circles that we've been running around in for the last 2 years, it's the only answer that satisfies everybody. And I suspect, we know that very many of the MPs who are somehow quietly sloshing around in the middle, hoping all this goes away, I think would fall in behind something like that, particularly if it's presented to them as the only possible option.
Okay, thanks, Claire. Let's hear from Sam McBride from the newsletter. In a speech yesterday, Sam, Arlene Foster, the DUP leader, accused people of peddling myths about border checkpoints in a way to unpick the UK, pledged they would not succeed. Just wonder how you think the DUP is playing its hand, because whilst these parties in their letter say they represent the majority of opinion in Northern Ireland, clearly they have, the DUP, a very vital hand at Westminster. If you can stand up.
I'm tempted to act like a politician and just ignore the question and say what I've written down here, but I'll try to address it. I think one of the findings from this poll, which it does address the question, which really struck me, was the question about cameras. So in December, the British government and Brussels agreed that they defined really for the first time what a hard border meant. So these terms have grown up over the last couple of years, but they're a bit woolly at best at times. And they defined it in really sweeping terms, where they said that any infrastructure whatsoever would be unacceptable and would constitute a hard border. That was pretty striking because at the moment, as Paul has alluded to, there are cameras, number plate recognition cameras. They're pretty unobtrusive. You wouldn't know where they were necessarily. You might think it's a speed camera or whatever. What we see in this poll is really pretty firm evidence, if the poll is accurate, that Catholics are not as opposed to that sort of low-level type of infrastructure at the border as it might have been thought. Now, on one level, I think one has to wonder about the British government's position on that, because if they negotiated something in December on the understanding that this was completely unacceptable to Catholic opinion and to Protestant opinion, but actually it's not, what was their basis for that data? In that context, we know that last week Theresa May was reported to have said to Jacob Rees-Mogg that she wasn't confident that she would win a border poll if there was a border poll. Again, the data here tends to question what sort of data she's working off. So there are issues there. There is, I suppose it should be said, another aspect to this, that there's an argument that if you put cameras there, even if they are very unobtrusive, as one of the chaps who's quoted in the report said, they become a target themselves. Then you have to fortify it, and you begin this sort of spiral effect. The other aspect of this, just in a very broad sense, that I think is really crucial, is that we do have some data here, some hard data. We suffer in Northern Ireland from a paucity of data. We have very little polling, very little reliable polling. Newspapers like my own couldn't begin to commission a major poll which would cost £10,000 or £20,000. That would have been the case 20 years ago at the time of the Good Friday Agreement. It's no longer the case, and in that vacuum we have the danger of anecdote taking over and people making massive long-term constitutional decisions, economic decisions on bad data. So whatever we think about the EU or Brexit or anything else, it's very important to have this sort of data, and we should all welcome that. The final thing, just from what was said, I'm trying to remember who it was that said it now, but I think it was Brendan had reminded us about the line from the Good Friday Agreement about the commitments of the government to act with rigorous impartiality in the terms of Northern Ireland. That is obviously the case, but I think that raises a question as to whether rigorous impartiality means simply giving Northern Ireland what both communities want. So it's very clear in this poll, there's no question about that both communities, want to stay in the EU at this point, if not during the referendum, where unionism, I think, was more to leave. But if we do leave, as we almost certainly are going to be, they want it to be as soft as possible. Does the government, does the Irish and the British government jointly have a responsibility to just implement that, because that is what we want? I think there is an argument that by the very nature of being in a union of any sort, whether that is the British Union, whether that is the European Union, whether that's a marriage union, it involves compromise, it involves not getting everything that you want. You trade off certain things. You believe that you benefit in this area, you don't benefit in that area. And I think the interesting thing in this data is that it seems to suggest that the idea that, I suppose, liberal Protestant opinion in Northern Ireland, liberal unionist opinion in places such as North Down, where Lady Herman is the MP, that would really swing towards the European Union, that European identity would be more important than the other union in those people's minds. I think this polling seems to suggest at this point, and it might change, and there are warning signs for unionism here, but it seems to suggest that's not the case.
Thanks very much, Sam. Now, I think Paul Bew asked a point of clarification about cameras, so I'm going to go to John Garry for an answer on that, and then immediately after that we'll go over to questions from the floor, and hopefully people can be thinking about what they're going to ask. But just, John, on that point, could you just clarify about border infrastructure and cameras? Perhaps stand up just for the benefit of the cameras.
Yeah, thanks very much, Paul. Very reasonable question, as ever. I used the term new, which might have been a bit clunky. Our framing in both the representative sample and in the deliberative was things that would happen as a possible consequence of Brexit. And so, in other words, stuff that happens as a direct result of Brexit, whatever that is. We didn't specify exactly how many cameras, if they'd be on every road, if they'd be on some roads or whatever, but that was the way we framed it, and hence the use of my term new.
Thank you.
Okay, we've got about 20 minutes or so left on this session, so I'm going to start going over to you for the questions. Take them in about clumps of 2 or 3 at a time. Gentleman in the second row here, maybe to start off with.
The data was really interesting and really fascinating. But what remains is this is a negotiation between the United Kingdom and the EU. For the UK to change its position, the only data that's very important is the votes in the House of Commons, to be blunt. So with only the DUP having their seats and Lady Sylvia Herman, how do you feel you can influence this and this decisions? Because I think that is the only way that the UK will change its negotiating position.
Okay, thanks very much. I think hand was raised over there. Sorry.
Could you get to stand up?
Yeah, if you could stand actually and say who you are when you ask the questions, because could you just stand? Identify yourself, thanks.
Hello, I'm Jane Thomas. I'm the coordinator of the Repeal Bill Alliance, and we've been working with, amongst others, civil society organisations in Northern Ireland, particularly on the amendments that have gone through both in the Commons and recently on the Lords. You were right entirely about what you're saying about the rights and justice element and about the implications of the Charter going with the withdrawal bill and what the implications are for equality of rights, both north and south of the border. I think there's a specific question that I'm not quite sure the answer to, and it's been raised by the Committee for the Administration of Justice about the Common Travel Area and the Common Travel Agreement and passporting. And my understanding at the moment is that there is no passport controls, and that's part of the CTA agreement. Once we leave the EU, and there are different rights as regards the movement of people, it's what happens to passporting rights. Excuse me. And in particular, there's been already cases about racial profiling that you may be aware of. And I think that leads to potential problems specifically around the movement of people.
Okay, well, look, that's all for now. I might come to Máirtín both on representation in the House of Commons, because obviously, potentially, there could be Sinn Féin representation in the House of Commons, but you can explain to the audience your position on that. And passports, as far as I'm concerned, the CTA is meant to continue. We don't have to show passports as we go across the border. There are, though, occasionally immigration checks of a mobile kind near the border. I don't know if anybody else wants to tackle that one. But Máirtín, first of all, on the House of Commons arithmetic, and if you could stand.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark. No, well, Sinn Féin won't be in the Houses of Parliament, so we won't be influencing that vote. But I do think that the negotiations, you say, between the UK and the EU, the Irish government has an absolutely vital role in that, has remained consistent throughout, has backed the backstop. The backstop is a wonderful bit of prose. It's not just as lyrical as the Good Friday Agreement, but it's very clear. It says that there should be full regulatory alignment between North and South. It says that the customs union, we will remain in the customs union. The EU's also said, and this related to infrastructure on the border, and the EU has rejected any infrastructure on the border, but the words aren't avoiding a hard border. The words are avoiding any hardening of the border. That's what the EU is committed to. The EU is also committed to, and you talk about rights and diminution of rights, is committed to defending the Good Friday Agreement and all its parts. But as well as that, as European citizens now and post-Brexit, I will remain an EU citizen. The EU has committed to defend in totality my rights as a European citizen, plus the benefits and opportunity of the European Union. So, for example, that would mean absolute the right for free movement across the European Union for me, but it also should mean representation in the European Parliament. So how will my rights as an Irish citizen, as a European citizen post-Brexit be defended? How does the EU go down into the devil of the detail of ensuring post-Brexit that my rights are protected in all sorts of ways, but in particular in terms of representation? I say that because, again, it goes back to values. Because for me, Brexit, and God bless the British people, I hope Brexit goes well for them, but Brexit for me is about isolationism. It's about looking back to the Empire 2.0. It's about looking inwards. And we have done a lot of that in Belfast. We have a lot of peace walls in Belfast. So if anybody understands the dangers and folly of increased separation, it's us in Belfast. So we want to look forward and look out, and we will get to the detail. But at this stage, in terms of negotiation, at this stage, the EU 27, led by the Irish government, is absolutely steadfast on the backstop. And for me, that is where we stand. We want special status, unique status. And just finish, I think there's a lot of FT readers here, or some FT readers here. Wonderful headline last Friday where they said May, or British PM May, or Mrs May concedes customs union, and went on, despite opposition, but went on to quote Michel Barnier, who said there must be specific proposals for Northern Ireland. So what he was saying was, these are wonderful computations and you're going to work out how you're going to sort out the British exit. But he said, for us who live in the north of Ireland, there must be specific proposals. And for us, that is the backstop, that is special status, that is unique status.
I'm going to come to Claire Hanna now. Claire, both you and Máirtín are in South Belfast, and obviously that was a constituency that until the snap election was held by the SDLP, then it went to the DUP, so now it's a vote for Brexit. But what we should also point out to those who were maybe just focusing on the English local elections, that we had a by-election on the same day in Northern Ireland in a border seat where you would have thought Brexit would have been a big deal, and Sinn Féin won that on an abstentionist platform, and the argument that you should take your seats really had no impact on the results. So, Claire.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. The EU and Dublin are doing a tremendous job of protecting the interests of North and South of Ireland, but it's my view that they can take the sting out of Brexit. But as you say, it's only the UK that can really soften it in any meaningful way. I appreciate that Sinn Féin have a majority for abstentionism. It is worth saying that there was the most substantial swing from Sinn Féin to SDLP that there has been in about 20 years in that by-election 2 weeks ago. But I'm with respect to say I think the policy of abstentionism is ridiculous. There are very many Republicans in Britain who aren't great monarchists, but can see it, and there have been very many great number of great Irish nationalists over the years who have taken their responsibility seriously. Lady Sylvia Herman, who I am a huge admirer of and does represent Remain to the best of her ability, but one MP can't represent 56 or 69 now percent of the electorate. And while I think she's somebody who does understand, she can't represent the Irish nationalist dimension and perspective, which your data shows is very different. And it is fair to say that the further you are from the border, even in South Belfast, the border issues aren't quite so acute. So we believe, or I believe, that the neatest route out of this is, and certainly the route the angle I've been working is with Labour MPs, and particularly people who have put a lot of investment into peace in Northern Ireland and in Ireland, and if they have that commitment, and there are very many who see, as I do, that as I outlined, single market and customs union are the only way to do that. But I share your concern about the rights issues as well, and while the common travel area we're told will persist, and it is a separate work stream, there's still a lot of it'll be all right on the night, and that's not good enough. There isn't legal underpinning for a lot of those things, and we are very worried about what might become racial profiling and essentially turning legal immigration, and as well as how those sets of rights might diverge. I just think that educational establishments and health service and so on have plenty to be doing without checking people's entitlements in those ways.
I think, Brendan, you wanted to come in particularly on rights and passport issues, if you want to stand whilst you speak, sorry.
I didn't want to come in on rights and passports. I agree with what was said. I did want to comment on the outlook of the gentleman in the second row, which I think characterises the dispositions of the English. I think the English will understand the EU only after they've left it. The EU is a treaty-based organisation, it's a confederation, its definitive source of final authority is the Court of Justice of the European Union. The votes of those justices will be decisive on the respecting the integrity of any withdrawal agreement, not the votes in the House of Commons. So if you have a model in your head which says that everything finally will be decided inside the House of Commons, you're mistaken. It's not simply a bilateral negotiation, it's a negotiation with the EU 27. Now, if you think I'm spelling out the obvious, I do so for a reason. The UK has a most archaic political system, the principle of parliamentary sovereignty, and you expressed it. And that principle is deeply problematic because it explains perfidious Albion. Perfidious Albion is not some mistake or insult by foreigners. It's an accurate representation of your constitutional disposition. Any parliament can unwind any treaty. It's not binding in UK constitutional law. You made the Good Friday Agreement solemnly with Ireland, and yet you claim in your constitutional tradition to be able to modify any feature of that agreement according to any wish of any future parliament. That makes you a fundamentally unreliable partner in the making of treaties or constitutional arrangements. The one thing I hope will happen if the UK does leave the European Union is that it learns to constitutionalise itself, so it can have better relations with the nations inside the UK and better relations with its neighbours. That's an editorial.
I thought that was an advert for the pub The Constitution, which is just around the corner. Anybody else got questions from the audience? Let's get some more questions. There's a gentleman there with his hand up just halfway down. If you could say who you are and stand up, please, that'd be great.
Donald McCarthy from the RSPB. I've got a question about North-South cooperation. The December 2017 joint report was about more than just avoiding a hard border. It was also about protecting North-South cooperation. And environmental NGOs, North and South, that we've been working with certainly are quite interested in this question of how you maintain alignment with all relevant rules, or the question of how you maintain this cooperation. The backstop solution that the European Commission has put forward has actually very little to say explicitly on this question. The focus is almost entirely on trade in goods and how to maintain frictionless trade across the border, but actually doesn't really address the cooperation issue in terms of the extent to which an explicit alignment will be required. I'd be very interested to hear the views of the panel on how that cooperation might be maintained and how this question might actually affect public opinion as well.
Okay, anybody else with a question from the floor? Sorry, just here at the front. Get a microphone to this gentleman. If you care to stand and say who you are.
Yes, I'm Keith Best. I'm the Secretary of the European Movement in the UK. So this is really to endeavour to introduce a bit of light humour into the debate.
Go for it.
After Brexit, of course, all citizens of Northern Ireland, because they're entitled to an Irish passport, will have free movement throughout the EU, which will, subject to the negotiated settlement, be denied to British citizens. Would you expect to see a sudden influx of people from Britain moving into Northern Ireland as a result?
Who knows? Immigration wasn't a big point in the campaign, I think, back in 2016. Who wants to take on something to do with North-South cooperation? I'll have a comment on that. John Garry's going to have a go at that, and also possibly at the new influx of population we're going to get.
No, I'll just do one, the first one. We did ask in our representative survey and deliberative forum questions of the public about not only North-South cooperation but East-West cooperation after UK exit, and we asked people how much knowledge they felt they had of certain institutional vehicles that are already existing that could possibly deal with some post-Brexit problems, like the North-South Ministerial Council, the British-Irish Council, and people said they didn't know too much about them. We had hoped to get a big discussion going in the deliberative forum about this, and not an awful lot happened, it has to be said. And instead, people were more comfortable about talking in general terms about North-South relations and East-West relations. And the general message coming there was a lot of positiveness there. In other words, people said nice things about North-South relations, particularly as a direct function of the peace dividend. So you got the sense that there was a reservoir of goodwill there. And also with respect to East-West, people said nice things about the cultural similarity of Irish people and British people. But there was an intriguing pattern that did emerge to an extent, was that some participants in the deliberative forum expressed a disappointed sense of distance from the mothership, if I can put it that way, or the patron state. So some Catholics more or less said, well, you know what, the South doesn't really want us. Some Protestants said, look, I'm proud to be British, but they'd throw us under a bus. They don't really like us terribly much when it comes to it. So there was a slight sadness and a slight expressed alienation of the people in both communities in Northern Ireland with respect to their relevant parents, as it were. And actually, quite literally, in some of the conversations, Northern Irish people talked as literally as an unwanted child. And their parents don't want us. And there was a sense coming out in the deliberation that Northern Ireland really is an issue talked about rather than a conversation between equals. There was a sense of voicelessness that came out and a sense of lack of agency amongst the deliberating citizens. It was almost a sense of, well, it doesn't really matter what we think. No one will take a blind bit of heed of us anyway. And that was that was a tad grim if you're looking at this on a democratic ticket.
Well, we could insist that the rabbits and the hares get passports and stop at the border. But if you look at the backstop, it talks about a full regulatory alignment in all areas of cooperation. So that includes the birds and the bees. And that's the sort of detail we will get into. I think they've identified 148 areas, but that would certainly include cooperation between the RSPB and your colleagues in the south of Ireland. I want to say this, just a serious piece about, I don't know about birth tourism. Someone has predicted that people will come from Britain and have their babies in the city hospital in Belfast, because then you will have ad infinitum for that child European citizenship. It hasn't happened yet, but I did read an editorial about that. But let me say this about this powerful proposition. imagine a situation that the only area within what is now the European Union that is still in the European Union as regards the single market and the customs union, but also is absolutely free trade and no barriers to trade or other cooperation with the island of Britain. That area for me would have a powerful proposition to attract investment, that you could say to US investors, and I spent a little bit of time trying to woo and charm US investors by saying, come to our benighted 6 counties, because the great gateway to the EU. Now, we can't say that post-Brexit under Mrs May's version, but if we actually remained in the customs union and single market, we would have, in my view, the best of both worlds. So that's certainly part of what we are saying, that instead we of course, are far behind the South in terms of economic performance, but this could be, as the Yanks say, a game changer. And you're very welcome. You want to have a child in Belfast, let me know.
Paul, and then we'll go around that way.
Okay, thanks.
Paul Bew next.
Just to respond to the question about North-South cooperation, one of the major things about the Good Friday Agreement and the anniversary of the referendum is 20 years today, was the fact that Unionist opinion was traditionally very neuralgic, highly suspicious at the time of the framework document, mid-90s, of North-South cooperation. Actually, it's been the uncontroversial working of the agreement. We've had decommissioning, police reform, today the Irish language, all manner of other issues have created a problem. It isn't a problem, not even all the areas that Máirtín has talked about, but it needs to be protected, and this is a crucial thing. The second point I make is that Para 48 and 49 of the transitional agreement, which does contain, unfortunately, ambiguous language and endless amounts of ink have already been spilt interpreting it, but nonetheless, it is perfectly clear that if you have a working set of institutions at Stormont, the reference to the protection of the Good Friday Agreement in Para 49 takes on great significance and has a fundamentally benign democratic significance as to how you interpret what you might do in terms of alignment, what's necessary, what's not. Absence of proper functioning in Stormont, it just looks like a pious phrase, the commitment to protection of the Good Friday Agreement in 49. And I think it's therefore it's for that reason and many, many others, it is desirable to return to power sharing devolution, because otherwise Paris 49 50 are a bit ghostly and hollow in their meaning. And I've talked about the importance of commentary in that, but Patrick Smith's column the day after on December the 9th, an interpretation of Paris 48 and 49 does draw attention to the very great importance of Stormont and how those proposals, paragraphs, might be interpreted. And therefore, if you're thinking about democratic compromise, if you're thinking about the great achievement of the Good Friday Agreement, in David Trimble's words, to end the Cold War between North and South, sadly, that's been broken. And the fact of the matter is, there is no question, there's no point in living in the happy past. There is a Cold War now, and it's dangerous, unfortunately. But if you're thinking about these things, it is also desirable to see the return of power sharing devolution at Stormont and the reawakening of non-controversial, surprising to many, but non-controversial North-South cooperation. And that's a way of sorting out some of these possibly difficult issues of alignment. By the way, huge parts of the economy of North and South are totally aligned agriculture right now.
Yeah, it is tragic actually how the North-South institutions and bodies and mechanisms had withered on the vine, and as Mark Durkin had put it, we're all treating the Good Friday Agreement like a relic on the ornament, on the mantelpiece, like an ornament, rather than the toolkit that could deal with a lot of these things. But it is the whole of Europe talking about the Good Friday Agreement, and then you come to Belfast in Northern Ireland where those institutions should be operating and they aren't, and that is one of the problems with the backstop to me, that with the best will in the world, we don't have an assembly at the moment, and if we had one, and with respect to Máirtín and myself and others, you would need a lot of people who really like transposing European directives and all that kind of stuff to keep pace, and we would all need lobotomies, I think, for that to work in any serious way. But also the other issue around the backstop is that we have to hear what political unionism is telling us, that it is about a UK-wide solution, and anything else is intolerable to them, and the backstop and that potential divergence is problematic politically, and I don't believe it would survive its first challenge. And somebody would challenge, a business would challenge it, or whatever, about some of those actions working across. About the residency, and that's of concern to people, that we need to nail down those rights by citizenship and not by residency. There were issues already about how EU citizens could get cheaper tuition in Scotland, and a lot of people in Northern Ireland went, happy days, I've got my Irish passport, but then it was linked to their address. I know I have never signed as many passport forms in my life as I have since Brexit, and from people that you really, really, really would not expect to be getting Irish passports. But I think your parent analogy is very relevant, and I think people do, it is like a grown-up child who both parents are saying, we love you, but don't come and live with me, you know, and I think that is something that people feel, and that is exacerbated by the dereliction of duty of leaving us without an executive. And I think some of the decisions that were judicially reviewed last week about political decision making, and the fact that civil servants do not have, you know, the mandate and the ability and the liberty to make those decisions, that inability to test out some of these theories, and just the cynicism that grows. And I will just say one thing about the Good Friday Agreement referendum. I was reading some of the literature today, somebody had posted up, the optimism and the possibility just jumps off the page of a lot of the literature that people put out 20 years ago, and that is being squeezed out, and the belief that the Assembly can fix our problems is being squeezed out with every month that it's not there fixing our problems.
Thank you. I'm going to come to Brendan in a moment, but I'm aware Sam's been sitting quiet for quite a while. Sam, we heard a couple of calls there for what a great thing it would be if the Assembly came back, and I should point out that Sam has made a bit of a name for himself in recent weeks as an eagle-eyed observer of the inquiry into the scandal which brought down the Assembly into the first place. We won't go into all the details of that, but one of the aspects that's come out of that inquiry is that it's fair to say that Stormont's functioning has been brought into question as to whether it was an efficient form of government anyway in the first place. One wonders whether it would have made any difference either way to the Brexit debate if Stormont had been up and running and we hadn't had two crises running concurrently.
We actually saw a partial answer to that in one of the slides which John took us to earlier, where somebody was expressing the view that it would make very little difference. I think that it would have been difficult for the DUP and Sinn Féin as the lead parties in an executive facing in opposite directions on this issue. On most of the issues, it's not to say there's not common ground between them on various issues. Arlene Foster and Martin McGuinness were able to sign a joint letter in the early stages of this process which did agree in certain areas, so they could have perhaps presented something of a united front in some areas, but fundamentally they were very divided. The question about the common travel area, I think, is a really critical one, and it's one which is misunderstood, not just in London and in parts of the UK and elsewhere, but in Northern Ireland. And again, we saw a hint of that in one of the slides. The lady in the slide who had talked about going across the border to the spa or to walk her dog, that is the sort of thing which is classically under the common travel area. So that is about free movement within the island of Ireland or within the British Isles, if you like, because it actually extends beyond Northern Ireland. That was one of the first areas, really big, significant areas that was agreed. That was incredibly significant. Its significance is almost forgotten now because we've got into this incredible debate which has gone on for months about trade. That's a much more discrete area of debate. For most people, they will not notice that in their daily lives. It will impact them in other ways, indirectly. It's very important. But the issue of the common travel area would have been massively destabilising if it had not been sorted. The idea that you have to produce a passport to travel either as a unionist within your own country, or if as an Irish nationalist you view Ireland as an island, as your country essentially, and you have to be stopped at the border. That is of psychological and political importance, and the fact that that has been addressed is almost forgotten now because of the other areas of contention.
Okay, Sam, and Brendan, you wanted to get a word in here?
Sorry, thanks. You're giving me the big mic? Thank you.
That's been covered both ways, yeah.
Okay, thanks. Both Paul and Hanna emphasised the merits of restoring a power-sharing executive and assembly in the north. I couldn't agree more. But if you're going to respect the Good Friday Agreement in all its parts, both London and Dublin need to reactivate the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference. Its remit is the totality of relationships minus the exclusively devolved powers of the Northern Assembly. That gives it a lot of work to do. And it's going to have a lot of work to do if the UK leaves the European Union. There will be no other forum for regular bilaterals between the governments, whether that is to regenerate the power-sharing executive and assembly or to deal with other side consequences of the UK's departure from the European Union. It is a criticism that can be placed squarely at the feet of both governments, both the London and the Dublin government, for allowing that core institution to fall into desuetude. I don't think it's irretrievably lost, but it has to be reactivated to manage the current crisis. Obviously, it's a little difficult at the moment, given the strain between Dublin and London, but it will have to be done.
Thanks. Now, there's a couple more people wanting to get questions in. Have we got time or not? Do we need to call it a day now? I'm sorry about that. Thank you very much. I hope that you all enjoyed that. And can we have a round of applause for our panel?